Hey, welcome back to Paleo. This is our second to last class, so we're going to talk about plants today. We're going to spend a little bit of time on palynology when we talk about paleoclimatology next Wednesday. And then that's the end. So we're almost through, so hang in there. And hopefully you're still doing okay at home and finding a productive environment to watch this stuff. And hopefully still enjoying the class, and we're almost done, so let's keep at it. So a couple announcements. It's going to be live, synchronous on Blackboard from 10:30 to 12:30, so make sure your calendars are booked off, make sure you're available during that time. All right, so let's talk about what we talked about. So which of the following ichnofossils are made by trilobites? So looking at that list of things there, which of these is made by trilobites? And just to be clear, I'm not going to like quiz you on individual ichnogenera, but this is kind of to reinforce a point here. So which of these is made by trilobites? Three, two, one. And the answer is those first three. So an individual trilobite species is capable of making all three of those different traces, and not just one trilobite species, but pretty much any trilobite species that behaves in that very similar way. So Rhizophycus is sort of their resting trace, that depression when they stop to rest. Cruziana is sort of their foraging trace as they're sort of furrowing through the mud, and Diplycnides is kind of the scurrying movement trace. So any one single trilobite can make all three of these. So keep in mind that it's not a one-to-one link between ichnogenera and animal genre. One animal can make different traces, just like we can make a lot of impressions in the mud or in the snow. And also, any one trace might be made by multiple different animals. So it's not a one-to-one match. And in a lot of cases, we don't even know which animal matches with which trace. And Scolithos is another very important ichnofossil. Those are those kind of vertical burrows that form in the sandy substrates. So the next review question. So in areas of high wave energy and shifting sands, burrows tend to be which? So what do you think? So if I'm a critter and I'm trying to be safe in my burrow and the sand is moving around me at all times and I don't want to get buried, what am I going to do? 3, 2, 1, 0. So vertical and U-shaped. So basically, the fact that it's vertical means they can go up very quickly or they can go down very quickly. And the U-shaped kind of does the same thing. They're able to move up and down and kind of cross over, and it provides some different escape options for them. So in areas of very high energy, very dynamic shifting substrate, vertical burrows are the method. And when you get to quieter, calmer environments, they tend to get kind of more and more horizontal, more and more ornate, more and more meandering, until you get into like the deep water, like Nereides, ichnofacies. So if you take one thing away from the ichnofossil lecture, kind of take that kind of general rule of thumb. If the burrows are more vertical, that's probably very high energy. If they're more horizontal, that's probably lower energy, as a general rule. All right, so let's talk about plants. So one thing that's interesting about plants is that there's actually a different timescale defined for plants that we generally don't use as geologists, but it's important for paleobotany. But we're very familiar with, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic. So remember zoo, like zooplankton. Zoo is life, but it's really more specifically, it's animal life. So our geologic timescale that we think about is very like animal-centric. So like the going from the Proterozoic to the Phanerozoic is when we get visible animal fossils. The transition from Paleozoic to Mesozoic is defined by the extinction of a lot of those traditional Paleozoic animals, especially trilobites in this case. And then going from Mesozoic to Cenozoic is that transition from kind of the age of reptiles, the dinosaurs, into the age of mammals, us. So generally we think about the timescale as animals, but for paleobotany, that's not quite as useful. So there's this concept of phytic eras that have been defined that are sort of an alternative to the zoic eras that we're more familiar with. And the timescale sort of sounds familiar. So way back here, it's not on here, but the Archeophytic. So that's like things like the stromatolites. We'll kind of go through these as we go. And then we get into Prokaryotic. So just like Proterozoic was like the very early animal life, Prokaryotic is the very earliest plant life. Then we get into Paleophytic, old plants, Mesophytic, middle plants, and Cenophytic, new plants. So pretty cool way of dividing this up. And you'll notice that the land floras and the land faunas kind of change, but they don't necessarily change in sync with each other. So like the transition between the Paleophytic and the Mesophytic is in the kind of earliest Permian, as opposed to the end Permian, Great Dying. The transition between Mesophytic and Cenophytic happens a little bit after the start of the Cretaceous. So pretty interesting. And then this is just kind of a history of plant evolution. And these are all the kind of major plant groups. And what you'll notice sort of quickly is that there's not quite as many. It's not as complicated. And we'll kind of discuss that in the discussion, but kind of think about, you know, why might there not be quite as much diversity in plants as there are in animals? All right, so let's talk about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is sort of like the defining feature of plants. If you're a plant, you're a photosynthesizer. There are some plants that are carnivorous, so like the pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, but they photosynthesize as well. So, so for the most part, plants are getting their energy from photosynthesis, from the sun, photo, light, synthesize to build. So the earliest are the blue-green, quote-unquote, algae, and they were named that before we actually really kind of knew what they were. They're actually prokaryotic cyanobacteria. So again, remember prokaryote means it doesn't have a nucleus. It doesn't have really true organelles. So this is a cyanobacteria kind of cross-section here. And the chlorophyll is held in these kind of like thylakoid membranes. So they're not really organelles. There's no like chloroplasts in cyanobacteria. But this is the most important part of this is the photosynthesis equation. This is one of the most important equations on Earth. It makes all life really possible. They take in, I should say, animals do not, they take in light, water, and carbon dioxide, and they build plant tissue, they build sugars, and they release oxygen. And this forms the basis of the food chain for all of animal life, because all of animal life derives its energy from eating these plants. They're sort of like these little solar panels that are converting sun energy into organic energy, and animals consume that organic energy, and that's really the start of the food web. Animals don't have any way to make energy from sunlight. Without plants, the basis of our entire food chain would collapse. The other thing is we all need to breathe oxygen. The oxygen that's in our atmosphere came from plants, came from photosynthesis. So let's take a look at the plant cell, and we mentioned this a little bit before, but let's just kind of reinforce it. So the first like true eukaryotic plant cell likely formed through endosymbiosis. So when we talked about endosymbiosis earlier, like the origins of life and early life, again, endosymbiosis, internal symbiosis, it's this idea that the evolution from prokaryote cells to the more complex and larger eukaryote cells might have happened as a result of these like amoeba-like prokaryotes kind of Pac-manning up these other prokaryotes that did different things. So the first thing that probably happened was swallowing up mitochondria. Both animal and plant cells have mitochondria, the quote-unquote power plants of the cell. But the next thing that probably happened was that a version of that cell kind of gobbled up a cyanobacteria. And that cyanobacteria is still hosted in eukaryotic plant cells today as the chloroplast. So this is a cross-section of the chloroplast. So a chloroplast is, again, these thylakoid membranes with their photosynthetic things stacked up into these grana. A chloroplast very much looks like a cyanobacteria, and in many ways it kind of is. They have their own membranes, they have their own DNA, just like mitochondria do. Cells cannot replace them. The mitochondria have to replace themselves by splitting, almost like a mitosis, except it's at the organelle level. So pretty interesting. The complexity change stepping up from prokaryotes to eukaryotes was probably a result of this endosymbiosis. And chloroplasts in all living plants are probably like the remnants of this very early symbiotic arrangement between this amoeba-like prokaryote and cyanobacteria. And obviously over time they've become kind of more tightly knit with each other, but the evidence is still kind of there in the kind of shared anatomy. All right, so let's talk about the Archeophytic. So we talk about like the Archean eon. This is sort of a plant equivalent, the Archeophytic. So what dominates the Archeophytic, really the only thing in the Archeophytic, are stromatolites. So stromatolites are kind of those cabbage-like mounds. And in many ways, they're not really truly fossils. They're mats of mud that are held together by cyanobacteria filaments. And so these filaments were sort of recognized a little bit earlier than the confirmed nature that these are body fossils. But generally, when you're looking at a stromatolite, you're not actually preserving the cyanobacteria, you're preserving the mats that they sort of helped to build. So the like biotic nature that's what was happening wasn't really totally confirmed until we were able to observe living ones. So this is from Shark Bay in Australia, and it's one of the few places on Earth where stromatolites still exist. So currently they only form in very harsh conditions, but back at this time in the Archeophytic, they were everywhere. They were global, probably covering everywhere that there was enough water to sustain them. So why are they only in these harsh conditions now? One of the ideas is that as soon as, you know, the metazoans arose, the complex animals, multicellular animals arose, they started feeding on this stuff. They have no real defense. They can't go anywhere. They don't have any protective skeletons. They don't have any defense whatsoever. They're just essentially pond scum. And so as soon as animals were able to predate on them, they were pretty much pushed to the edge of extinction. And they're currently only found in areas where complex animals can't exist, whether it's because they're hypersaline, which as the case of Shark Bay, or just like really strong currents where the animals can't actually stay. One thing that's pretty interesting is that if you go out near Saratoga Springs, there's the petrified rock gardens, I think it's called, in Leicester Park. And it's just an amazing abundance of stromatolites. Most of the rock that you're walking on are these pavement outcrops, and you can actually see the cabbage stromatolites in there. So pretty cool that that's right in New York, one of the better collections of stromatolites, fossilized stromatolites. It's a very cool place. If you get a chance, I definitely encourage you to go check it out. So that's the Archeophytic, and that's like the majority of the time scale. And then we move into the Proterophytic. So Proterophytic kind of begins with the first like true eukaryotic plants, which are probably the acritarchs, although there's a little bit of debate around that. And then it ends with the appearance of vascular plants, like what we really think about as true plants. Acrotarchs, so these are acrotarchs here. They're like the first really like body fossils. So remember, like cyanobacteria stromatolites, it's mostly the mats that are preserved, not the actual fossils themselves. These are actually preserved as fossils because they have not really hard parts, but they've got these cell walls of sporopollenin, and so acrotarchs are really the first thing that's like preservable because they have like a hard outer wall. Not really like a mineralized outer wall, but it's a hard organic outer wall. And so we're able to actually start preserving them as body fossils. And they're a little, their classification's a little problematic, and there's a little bit of debate about them, but they're probably the first eukaryotic plants. Their cells are larger than cyanobacteria, more complicated, but again, like preserving organelles and things like that is very difficult. It's hard to pin down exactly what these things did when they were living from very sporadic, very difficult to read fossil evidence. So at this time in the Prokaryotic, on land, so the first plants that actually go on land are probably these like cryptogamic soils. They're like these biological crusts. And you find these a lot in kind of arid to semi-arid areas today, where it's like the soil is sort of crusted together and held together by this community of fungi, cyanobacteria, bryophytes, which we'll talk about in just a second, and algae. And in modern crusts, it's lichen, but they don't emerge till later in the fossil record, if they really have a very limited fossil record. But these crusts are very fragile and very delicate, and they take a really long time to develop. And so out west, where these things are pretty common, you'll see a lot of these signs like stay on the trail, don't turn the crust to dust, don't bust the crust. So if you want people to do something, apparently you have to make a cool witty rhyme. So maybe we need one for social distancing. Maybe there already is one, I don't know. But yeah, stay on the trail, let the crust live. Kind of a dramatic interpretation of this, but again, it's like these very small, very primitive plants kind of binding this crust together, and they're very delicate and they take a long time to grow. So people like to preserve them and stay on the path. So so this is what the land surface looked like, even without these kind of scrubby plants here, just bare rock, or like this very, very primitive cryptogamic soil, no true plants to speak of. The first thing that we would probably recognize as like a plant, a quote unquote plant, would be the bryophytes. So things like mosses, liverworts, hornworts. These are things that we recognize as plants, right? So one thing that's interesting about them is they do not have xylem and phloem. They don't have vascular tissue. They don't have any way of transporting water or nutrients from like a root system to like leaves, and so they kind of just don't have that, which means they're restricted to moist areas, and it means they're also restricted to being close to the ground, and so they're sort of these more like encrusting forms. They don't really get above the ground surface. So at this point in time, the biosphere, the plant biosphere on land is two-dimensional. Nothing's really reaching up into the sky. It's a two-dimensional flat surface, and when that flat surface is colonized, it's full. There's nothing else you can really do. And that's kind of what life on land was like in the early Ordovician, and there's some evidence that it's all the way back into the Cambrian, but certainly by the Ordovician, there's at least some greenery on the land, and there's already insects that have come out of the water, but still, remember, there's no like true land animals here. So these things are able to kind of live without any like, you know, large scale predation. The next big step is in the Paleophytic, and it defines the start of the Paleophytic. The first vascular plants appear, and again, when we think of vascular plants, vascular bundles, the xylem that transports water and the phloem transports the food and also water. So these vascular tissue transports food and water just via capillary action, so they're not pumps. Just the nature of the small tube kind of pulls the water and the food up. And there's also this advance where lignin develops, which sort of supports in a rigid outer structure in vascular plants that actually forms the outside of these vascular bundles. And so not only do you have the vascular bundles to kind of move food and water up to higher elevations, you also have the lignin that develops as sort of like a scaffold, a support structure. And so plants are finally able to kind of start reaching up above the floor, the ground surface. So in many ways, it's sort of analogous to the marine surface where crinoids sort of start reaching up from the seafloor for the first time, where before that, everything was sort of limited to the 2D surface. So this is like the start of 3D tiering. And what we see is that that sort of happens from here on out. But this is Cooksonia, probably the earliest, or at least the earliest fossil evidence of a vascular plant. And it's very simple. It has stems and stalks. And then at the end, there's sort of these photoreceptors. They're not even really truly leaves. But this is like the first like very primitive example of this. And then it sort of evolves these like more fern-like forms. But the big key here is that the bryophytes, they need to be wet all the time. They can only grow in moist areas. They're kind of limited to where they can grow, very limited. They need to be wet all the time and they need water to reproduce. These are a little bit less restricted, but they're still somewhat stuck because the way that these things work, there's two different stages. There's a gametophyte and then a sporophyte. So the sporophyte bears spores. The spores germinate into a gametophyte. This process still needs moisture. And then they mature into the gametophyte, and this kind of cycles through. So they're still somewhat restricted to moist areas. If you're not going to find ferns in a dry area, but they were able to sort of move a little bit farther inland and exploit a little bit more. And then vascular plants kept developing more and more and more. And the earliest fossil forests, which are actually also in New York, so pretty cool, the petrified sea gardens in Saratoga, the kind of earliest, a good example of stromatolites are in Saratoga, although they're not as early as those. The first the oldest forest that we know of, the first earliest forest that we know of is in New York. Originally it was in Gilboa, but recently there was a more recent, earlier discovery made in Cairo, New York, just down the road a bit, so they're pretty close together. But basically it's these trees that are watiza, and there's basically, they started with a lot of trunks. The first thing they found was a lot of trunks, but recently we started finding leaves. And one thing that's interesting about plant fossils is that, plants shed their leaves, right? And so a lot of times you'll find leaf fossils, and a lot of times you'll find trunk fossils. It's sort of rare that you find both of them together. And so in the plant fossil record, what we'll see a lot is that the trunk gets one name and the leaf gets another name. And a lot of times we don't know what the trunk looks like that corresponds to the leaf. And we don't know what the leaf looks like that corresponds to the trunk. And so this is one example where we knew what the trunks looked like. We didn't know what the leaves looked like. The leaves were identified from other locations, and only recently we were able to kind of put the two together. So very interesting and problematic. So it's kind of a similar thing to with the ichnofossils. The trace makers and the traces are not really found together usually. The leaves and the trunks and the roots and things like that, they're not usually found together. It takes exceptional preservation to be able to find that together and kind of be able to put the whole story together. But I've never actually been here, but I would definitely like to go. But I have found some plant scraps working in the Catskills, in the Devonian Catskill clastic wedge, you do find occasional bark scraps. So there are plant fossils in New York State. We've been talking about invertebrates pretty much the entire time, but there are some plant fossils, and actually maybe some of the most important plant fossils, the first like true forest. So in this, Paleophyte era, another like very important plant that you should probably be familiar with is Lepidodendron. So Lepidodendron is sometimes called the scale tree. It's very common in the Carboniferous, and it's a lycophyte. Don't need to know what that means, but it's a lycophyte that have leaves directly attached to the trunk. And those leaves leave these like rhombohedral scars on the bark. So this is what it looks like. It's why it's called a scale tree. A lot of people sometimes mistake it for like fish scales. They're quite a bit larger usually, but this is what it looks like. So this is what the bark looks like, and these are what the leaves look like. And again, the bark and the leaves are not commonly found together, and so it can be kind of confusing as to exactly how they match up with each other. But Lepidodendron is important because it's basically the greatest contributor to Carboniferous coal. So in the Carboniferous, all of that carbon is being locked up in the coal swamps. And it actually led to the first, one of the first major glaciations, the Gondwanan glaciation in the Carboniferous. And it's kind of sort of ironic because at the time it was a carbon sink, and it pulled all that carbon out of the air and led to global cooling. And with the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning that ancient carbon, that fossil fuel, and it's now leading to global warming. So eventually you got to pay the piper. The carbon was locked up. It would have stayed locked up for millions more years before it was subducted or destroyed or metamorphosed somehow. But we released it, and we released it quite quickly. Processes that generally take millions of years, we've done in hundreds to decades. So most of the coal that we burn, though, is Lepidodendron, and it's sort of very similar to the living ground pine. So this is an example of ground pine, kind of a stocky, it looks superficially like pine. It's not a true conifer, but it resembles it. People like using them in like Christmas wreaths and things like that. Another important tree here, or plant, is the Calamites. So Calamites is a segmented tree in the Carboniferous. It's a spenophyte with really long, hollow, and kind of the characteristic are these joints. And at each of these joints, there's kind of these whorls of leaves. So you can see on this picture here, at each of the joints in the bark, there's these whorls of leaves. It's very similar to living horsetail rushes. Sometimes they're called scouring rushes. You'll find these occasionally along hiking trails and things like that. They're kind of rare, but they're there. They're called scouring rushes because they actually have some silica in them, and like pioneers would use them to actually clean out their cookware and things like that, because they're kind of abrasive and they have this nice like brush to them. A lot of people use like a dish brush to wash dishes now, and these are kind of a naturally occurring dish brush, complete with an abrasive. They're another pretty large contributor to Carboniferous coal, but nowhere near as much as Lepidodendron. But again, this is kind of what the bark looks like, kind of striated with the segments, and this is what the leaves look like. And then we make a transition into the Mesophytic. So the thing that really drives this Mesophytic revolution is that it's the invention of gymnosperms, so the naked seed. So when we think about seed plants today, we mostly think of flowering plants, but conifers, slightly more advanced type of gymnosperm, they also have seeds. If you open up a pine cone, you can see the seeds in there. This transition occurred before the Great Dying. So this transition in plant life, this major like upheaval, this major revolution from the Paleophytic fauna dominated by like very early vascular plants, sort of transitioning into the very earliest forests. This transition occurs before the end of the Permian. So it happens during the Permian, and actually at the end of the Permian during the Great Dying, plants aren't super affected by it. They kind of go on almost as normal. But basically what this is the seed is a lot more efficient than the spore. The gymnosperm seed is a lot more efficient. And so it actually allows plants to colonize even deeper into continental interiors. And so the earlier plants are sort of pushed to the margins at the marginal coal swamps. And this Glossopteris dominates tropical interiors. And one thing that's cool about Glossopteris is Glossopteris was actually one of the things that Alfred Wegener used as evidence for continental drift. So he saw these segregated, separated belts of Glossopteris occurring on all of the southern continents, all the Gondwanan continents, but they're very widely separated now. And how do you get a terrestrial plant across entire oceans? Well, humans do it now by transporting it, but before, how did that happen? Well, it didn't. The continents were together, it was a continuous belt, and then they rifted apart, and it made this appear to be disconnected, when in fact at the time it was fully connected, so pretty neat. And they can kind of be recognized by their striated leaves here. The next big revolution is going from the kind of more primitive gymnosperms into the true conifers. And conifers really pushed plants even further into the drier interiors, and now the land was truly colonized by plants. This should say plants, not plains. So Cordaeides is one of the most common Paleozoic conifers. This is kind of what it looks like here. Again, kind of more striated leaves. And one thing that's cool about conifers, well, first of all, if you go to the Adirondacks or some of the colder environs, conifers are prominent there. But coastal redwoods, the tallest trees on Earth, giant sequoias, the most massive trees on Earth, they're conifers. And so probably the most massive living organism on Earth right now, massive single organism, so Pando, the colonial quaking aspen, is bigger as a whole unit, but it's clonal individuals. The largest single organism on Earth, much bigger than a blue whale, is this General Sherman, the giant sequoia, and you can kind of see the scale here. It's just a massive tree. It might be the largest organism ever, but I'm not sure on that one, but it is the largest one on Earth. If there was something larger, it was probably just a larger giant sequoia. This is a truly colossal plant and just amazing amount of biomass. Things are taller, things are older, things are wider, but this is about as massive as it gets. So conifers are pretty important during the Mesozoic, so dinosaurs are kind of feeding on these things, but they're not very nutritious. Cycads are really kind of also not very nutritious. When we think about cycads, we think about things like palm sagos. So sago palms. You've probably seen these things around. They're very popular in gardens, not so much up here because it's too cold for them, but if you go down south, you'll see these all over the place. They're called sago palms, but they're not truly palms. Palms are broadleaf, but they're palm-like. They look like palms. So along with conifers and ginkgos, these cycads and cycadioids, they were the foundation of the early Mesozoic herbivores. Again, if you look at these things, they're not very nutritious. The leaves are relatively fibrous. There's not a lot of nice green nutritious material on there. And so there's a little bit of a debate about how the very early large Jurassic herbivores were able to sustain themselves. There's only 10 genera of these survive today, but when we look at dinosaur art renderings, we see a lot of these kind of cycads here. So they form the basis of the Mesozoic food pyramid, but they're not very nutritious. So how did those really large Jurassic dinosaurs, herbivores, feed on all this stuff? It's sort of an outstanding question. Then the last transition, the last major revolution here that gets us into the Cenophytic, the new plants, is the rise of flowering plants, the angiosperms. So again, this transition in the plant realm occurred pretty substantially before the transition in the animal world. And one thing that's sort of interesting is this transition was maybe fueled by the large herbivorous dinosaurs. So conifers, cycads, the early gymnosperms, they grow relatively slowly. Same thing with ferns. They grow relatively slowly. They're not very nutritious. Dinosaurs would be feeding on them and they'd be really slow to replace themselves. And so, again, remember there's always kind of this arms race between predators and prey. The herbivores are getting more efficient. They're getting more numerous. They're getting larger. They're probably decimating plant populations, and plants respond by becoming quicker to grow, shorter reproductive window, and there's kind of this move towards flowering plants. And so flowering plants develop a lot quicker. They can develop in one kind of growing season, all the way from starting off sprouting all the way to flowering and dispersing their seeds in one growing season, whereas conifers and cycads and early gymnosperms have to stick around for a while. So like think about like a pine tree. It takes a long time for a pine tree to first get its first cones. The other thing that probably happened here is that once we had these flowering plants, they started just taking over everywhere. So, you know, pollen is everywhere, flowering plants are everywhere. This was really able to move plants into kind of all niches of the terrestrial environment. And it also was probably the first like undergrowth. So up until this time, that kind of like 3D scaffolding was dominated by relatively short, low plants and relatively tall tree-like plants. And there really wasn't a lot in the middle. This might be one thing that allowed dinosaurs to get so big, was they were kind of unencumbered by undergrowth in the way. If you think about a modern forest, there's the mosses and stuff on the floor, then there's like ferns, and then there's like shrubs, and then you get up into the trees. And so like all tiers are occupied. The modern forest has a very complicated 3D tiering that didn't really appear until flowering plants appeared. Before that, it was very low stuff and very high stuff and not a lot in between. But in the Cenophytic here, the flowering plants, the angiosperms, really become dominant, and they just take over everything, and they represent 95% of extant vascular plant species. So pretty much anything you think of as a plant is probably a flowering plant. Now, obviously, conifers are an exception to that, but most everything you think of as a plant, 95% of vascular plants are flowering plants. One of the most important flowering plants are grasslands. Grasses, I should say. So in the early Cenozoic, grasses started kind of carpeting the landscape. So grasses evolved. Grasses were able to tolerate the cool, drier conditions in the Cenozoic. So not right away in the Cenozoic, the Paleocene and Oligocene are still fairly warm, but or Eocene, and then so like it starts dropping off pretty quickly in temperature after that, culminating in the ice ages. Plants, especially large plants like trees, kind of struggle in that cooler, dry environment, but grasses thrive. And so like the Pleistocene mammoth steppe environment, a very productive environment, was dominated by grasses, very similar to the modern African savanna, which is also dominated by grasses. And grasses are also important because they directly provide about 50% of our dietary energy. So for us, things like wheat, rice, corn, those are grasses. And even the rest of our energy comes from things that actually we feed the grasses too. So it's actually even more important than that. So without grasses, we probably couldn't support our kind of modern life. They're very important. And they're also relatively recent, so they didn't develop until the very early Cenozoic, or maybe in the very latest Mesozoic. But we don't often think of grasses as flowering plants because we usually cut them before they quote unquote go to seed. So if you let your lawn get long enough, it'll get these kind of seed heads on here and it'll actually flower. We don't generally get to see that, fortunately, unless you really let your lawn go. But grasses are very important and sort of latecomers on the stage. And so in total, if we look at kind of the whole history of plants, the plant evolution and their diversity, the amount of different groups is a lot lower than animal evolution. So why do you think that might be? That's something to post up in discussion. So why are there just way more different animal body forms, a lot more different animal niches than there are plants? Basically, again, overall, the story is that the plant life and animal life were a little bit out of sync with each other. The major revolutions in plant life occurred at different times than the major overturns in the animal life. But one thing to keep in mind here is that changes in plants drove changes in the animals, and also vice versa. Changes in animals, the plants had to respond. So there was always kind of this arms race between the two. And one resultant is that the angiosperms, the very quick reproducing, the very versatile, the very abundant angiosperms, they dominate the modern world, probably because they're best accustomed to compete with the large herbivores that are pretty common now. And so if we look at diversity of plants today, the number of species here is kind of staggering. If you look at the cone-bearing plants and the flowering plants, the ferns, the vascular plants, flowering plants are like 95% of these species, and then mosses and things like that, very, not very common, not very abundant. And this is kind of the whole sequence of things here, going from kind of ancestral green algae into the very primitive non-vascular plants, things like Cooksonia, the first vascular plants, the ferns, first primitive seed plants, conifers, flowering plants, and this is everything. This is all the major groups, all the major revolutions, a little simpler story than animal life. So why? Why do you think that that's the case? And next time we're going to look at paleoclimate. Next time, the last class, we're going to look at paleoclimate. One of the best indicators of paleoclimate is palynology, pollen from flowering plants. And so we're going to kind of look at that a little bit, and then that'll be the end of the class. So this is kind of the last chapter in the textbook, chapter 20, and then we're going to kind of go off the textbook for the last class. So hopefully you're still following along. Hopefully everything's going good. And I shall see you next time. Goodbye.